Hi, welcome to session 3 of the fourth topic of the semester, the slave trade and the coming of slavery to Virginia colony. We're looking at 1444 to 1740. So again, this is the third session, and we're going to proceed to cover the remaining portion of this lecture, which is now going to look at very briefly at the transatlantic slave trade, and just kind of have an overview of the international slave trade as a whole in terms of statistics, how many enslaved people from Africa were exported into different parts of the world, and then we're going to go into, of course, examining Virginia colony and understand the reasons by which Virginia colony ended up adopting this system of labor. Okay, so let us go then to our slide here and proceed from where we actually from where we left off here. Okay. All right. So we cover a great deal already in session 1 and session 2 of this topic, a great deal of material dealing with slavery in the ancient world, so how it was actually practiced, the reasons why people actually carried it out, how they justified it. We looked at Africa as well, how slavery was actually practiced in Africa for thousands of years. And we started looking also at the export slave trade as well, with the commercialization of sugar. Sugar is going to be central for understanding the export slave trade, which really brought peoples from many different parts of the world into the continent of Africa, starting with the Arabs, for example, that were moving into the north regions of Africa, in the eastern portion of Africa as well, to trade with those kingdoms of Africa in exchange for labor, because they were now developing sugar plantations. They needed labor to grow sugar. And so again, this is going to be one of the first reasons why they're going to be, again, in Africa, there's going to be people coming from the outside in pursuit of labor, and they're going to be exporting it again, first to the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean as well. They're growing also sugar in North Africa. And later on, they're going to be joined, of course, by the Europeans that also are moving into sugar production. We talked about that quite thoroughly. And again, this is going to lead the Spanish and the Portuguese to develop sugar plantations in a couple of islands, and the Portuguese are going to pretty much open up the trade with West Africa in 1444, and thereby initiating this process of commercial exchange that included, among other things, of course, the trading of course, human beings, labor, that is to say, servants. So we looked at that quite thoroughly, and then, of course, this trade that initiated between Portugal and West Africa intensified with the discovery of America. The discovery of America was really, again, a breaking point in human history for so many different reasons. Of course, a new continent has been discovered, etc. But as the Europeans are beginning to colonize it, in the 1500s, the Spanish and the Portuguese, they're very much interested in developing sugar colonies, sugar-producing colonies in the New World, and they're beginning to establish hundreds and hundreds of plantations in the Caribbean islands, for example, and also in Central America and Southeast Mexico, as well as in the Gulf of Mexico. Parts of also South America. The Spanish are going to develop plantations, sugar plantations, and the Portuguese are going to develop the colony of Brazil in South America precisely for that reason. Again, we see now this trade taking a whole new dimension, because the Spanish and the Portuguese pretty much, require labor in far greater numbers to grow the sugar. So when they go to Africa, when the Portuguese actually go to Africa, they're going to get there, particularly in order to acquire the labor that they need to take it, of course, to the Americas, so they can actually be used to grow sugar. But as we'll see, they're not just going to be growing sugar. There will be eventually other kinds of agricultural enterprises, other kinds of cash crops that will be introduced in the Americas, that, of course, the African slaves are also going to be very much engaged in the production of as well. So it got started with sugar. That's for sure. Again, this is what really gave the slave trade a new life, again, a new meaning for the Portuguese, who are going to actually monopolize the slave trade, by the way. So when the Portuguese arrived to 1444, I mentioned in session 2, they're going to claim a total monopoly again of the trade with Africa. It's because they were the ones that opened up the trade. They were the first ones to open up relationships with those kingdoms. They were the first ones to arrive to Africa. So the understanding is, whoever arrives to a certain region first before anybody else, they claim exclusive rights to trade with the kingdoms, with the princes, with the rulers, of those societies. So the Portuguese are going to monopolize the African slave trade for about 150 years. It will not be until the year 1600, again, by the year 1600, that the Portuguese are going to start losing their monopoly. And by that year, precisely when the 1600s are going to open up, we're going to see other Europeans also participating in the trade, not just the Portuguese anymore. They're going to be Dutch, there's going to be French, and there's going to be British as well, merchants arriving there to West Africa as well. Okay, the Portuguese will remain there, but they were just, again, another European party, again, that is engaged in this type of commercial exchange. But from 1444 to 1600, the Portuguese pretty much dominate the trade. Most of the African slaves transferred from Africa to the New World are transferred in Portuguese ships. And what the Portuguese do is that they provide, the labor to their own plantations in Brazil, but they also are the ones that are selling the labor to the Spanish that are growing sugar in the Caribbean islands, okay, or they're growing sugar in Central America, etc., and South Mexico. So the Spanish must obtain also slaves from the Portuguese, because the Portuguese are the main suppliers, the only suppliers. Okay, so by the 1520s, I mentioned in session 2, the Portuguese are going to now initiate what is called the transatlantic slave trade. That is to say, what the Portuguese are doing is that instead of just taking slaves from Africa to Europe, as it had been going on since 1444, now they're going to take the slaves from Africa across the Atlantic. They're going to cross the Atlantic Ocean and then cross, of course, into the Americas and take the slaves there. This is what is called the transatlantic slave trade. Again, it's like the Portuguese arriving to Africa, trading with the kingdoms of Africa, obtaining the labor, and then, of course, transferring, of course, the African slaves to the New World across the Atlantic. From 1520, this is going to be now a new type of trade in which what I have been mentioning in the past is how with the rise of international trade, there will be specific commodities that are going to dominate world trade. Starting with, of course, spices, okay, in the 1300s. The spice trade pretty much got started, the international trading network, again, between Europe and the Middle East and Asia. And after spices, there will be other commodities that are also going to be added again to this kind of commercial exchange. There will be, of course, silks, tea, there will be gold. From Africa, there will be ivory, there will be peppers and textiles and so on. But from 1520, what we're going to see is that African slaves will also become, again, one of the most traded commodities, again, in this Atlantic economy, in the Atlantic Ocean. What is being carried back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, particularly from Africa to the New World, again, besides carrying goods, besides the Portuguese and the Europeans coming to the Americas to bring certain products, again, African slaves will be, of course, brought in great numbers. And of course, now we're going to see the Americas, the American continent, really becoming part of a what is called a trading network that is going to be directly connected with Europe and Africa. So Africa, Europe, and America will now be interconnected economically, after 1520, precisely because of the slave trade. Again, this is going to create a triangular trading system in which, in this triangular network, it starts with the Europeans, the Portuguese, for example, arriving to Africa, bringing manufactured goods that are manufactured in Africa and in Europe. Okay, this is what the Europeans manufacture that are of great value to the Africans, like guns, gunpowder, for example, horses, tobacco as well. Okay, something, of course, they obtain from America. Alcohol and iron tools. Okay, so again, we're going to see that the Europeans bring cargo, they bring manufactured goods to Africa, they trade those manufactured goods for labor, which is called slaves, servants. They were called Slavs, which was a serf, in other words, a servant. Labor, again, in just in simplistic terms. And so they trade those manufactured goods for labor, for serfs or slaves, and then this is the second step, they take them to the Americas, and in the Americas, they're going to be working in some plantation, whether it's Portuguese plantation or it's going to be Spanish. But after the 1600s, there will be, of course, the French, the Dutch, and the British arriving as well to establish their own sugar plantations by the 1600s and 1700s. So the slaves are going to be laboring in those plantations to grow crops that will have to be exported back to Europe. Okay, those crops will be sugar, tobacco. So tobacco will be added. Again, it's not going to be just sugar, but it's dominant. The sugar agriculture is dominant. But it follows after sugar, tobacco. There's a great market for it, not only in Europe, in Africa, as you saw just a moment ago. The Africans also demand tobacco for trade. And this tobacco is grown in the Americas, by the way, and it's taken now in bulk to Europe, back to Europe. After it's grown in America, it's going to be taken back to Europe. Rice, coffee, cotton, and rum. It is in Europe. With that, the Europeans are going to package the sugar. They're going to package the tobacco, rice, coffee, cotton, sell it inside of Europe, but also the Europeans are in the process also of selling those products around the world as well. So there's a great market in Europe, but there's also markets elsewhere. So again, this is now connecting, as you see in this map. This Atlantic slave trade is creating a triangular system of trade that connects Europe, Africa, and America, and you can see the flow of course, of products coming back and forth from Europe to Africa to America and back again. So the Americas are now connected commercially, economically to the old world, okay, through this type of trade. Okay. Now the statistics, again, with that, of course, we're just now going to look at the statistic of numbers of the slaves that were exported out of Africa from 1444 all the way to 1870. 1870 is the end of the international slave trade. By 1870, it was declared illegal, in other words, by 1870. So it lasted over 4 centuries, a little over 4 centuries. So to the Americas, it is estimated that 12 million were exported from Africa to the Americas again. The vast majority went to Brazil, 5.5 million, and the Caribbean islands. So the great majority, again, of the African slaves that were moved to the Americas went either to Brazil or the Caribbean islands. Okay, and only a tiny fraction, 500,000, came to the British North American colonies, okay? Like Virginia, for example, Carolina, Georgia. So this is the vast majority, again, are going to go elsewhere, not to North America. Okay, this is very important. Europe, there were 2 million slaves that were actually imported into Europe during those 4 centuries. And a great many of them actually were imported into Portugal. By the 1600s, it was known that Portugal, 20% of the population of Portugal were actually from African descent. 20% again for the Portuguese. But they're also going to be going into places like France, Holland, Great Britain, Spain. They're going to be moving into different parts of Europe as well. To the Middle East, 6 million. Okay, the Arabs and the Turks that traded in North Africa moved about 6 million to the Middle East as well. So that's another thing, again, that in the Middle East we're going to see also an increase of peoples of African descent, and they're going to intermarry with the Arabs populations, and we're going to see Arab African populations again arising in the Middle East. And in Africa, what's significant to note is that there was also people that remained in servitude. Remember, it had existed in Africa for thousands of years, this practice. So again, through this process, 5 million were actually enslaved within the African kingdoms. So it continues to exist. And as a matter of fact, even to this very present day, as we speak today, there are still in Africa remnants of this practice. It continues in many regions of Africa, okay, particularly in the village setting. For example, there are, servants, for example, that they render themselves to servitude for survival reasons, in other words. So still, this practice is still very much alive today, although it's not, as all-encompassing as it was in the past, but still there's continuities, there's remnants of this practice in Africa. All right, so now let's move to part 3. This is the last portion that we must cover. That is going to deal with now the understanding of the reasons why this system of labor, African slavery, will be introduced in one of the British colonies of North America. In this case, we're talking about Virginia colony. So again, it's just, even though this is not the only colony that adopted slavery, but because there's also the Carolinas, of course, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, that will adopt slavery as well. So Virginia is not the only one, but it was the forerunner. Okay, it was one of the first colonies that actually instituted this system of labor, and the other colonies are simply going to mimic, they're going to imitate certain laws, certain structures of this institution, and they're going to adopt it in a very similar way as it existed in Virginia. So Virginia was like the forerunner. It provided a model of how this system could exist and how it could be carried out and so on. And others are going to simply imitate it, if you will. So it's a good case study for understanding, again, why there was a decision to adopt the system of labor. It's a labor system, by the way, and we have to go back to understand that decision, to understand the reasons why the Virginians adopted it, is because we have to go back to the very beginning of the colony in the early 1600s. When Virginia colony was established, remember, it was established as a company, Virginia Stock Company, a Virginia Stock Company. And one of the central purposes, the central goals of the company was to produce tobacco for England. Okay, so the colony was indeed a tobacco company. That the settlers, many of them are going to actually own the plantations, and the plantation owners themselves are like shareholders of the company, by the way. Okay, they're coming from England. They're being given land grants by the king, by the British Parliament, to come to this region of the world in order to develop plantations, this commercial enterprise, producing tobacco, and the tobacco must be exported back to the mother country, where the mother country is going to process or package the tobacco, and they're going to actually sell it in England and elsewhere. Okay, so this is the central purpose for Virginia Stock Company. And so when the British landowners arrived, many of whom were actually members of the British nobility, so back in England, there was a nobility, again, a group of landowners that were members of the English nobility that actually became stockholders, shareholders of this company. They were owning a share of the company. They provided investment, again, for the development of this company, and they were given a land grant to come and develop plantations. So when they arrived, of course, the issue is, well, we got the land, but who's going to actually work the land? Okay. Of course, there were Native Americans, and initially the idea is, well, there are no Native Americans, and so Native Americans can actually grow the tobacco. Okay, because after all, Native Americans know everything about tobacco. This plant is indigenous to America. The indigenous populations have used it for thousands of years. If anybody knows how to grow it, how to take care of the plant, how to actually harvest it, how to actually process it into, a cigar, etc., the way it was actually consumed, again, it was the cigars. Well, the Native Americans, they're the experts. They know everything about it. So initially the idea is, well, Native Americans can actually do this type of work. And initially they did. In the very first years of the colony, Native Americans were invited. They were brought into the plantations. They taught everything to the planters, by the way, about the plant. But eventually the Native Americans refused to work. They refused to work in those plantations because they did not understand the meaning of growing so much tobacco for exports. They did not understand the meaning of spending a great portion of your day just doing this thing. Okay? They understood that if you needed to grow food, they understood that. Well, you know, I'm growing food, I'm feeding people. But this is a sacred plant. Tobacco is really a sacred plant. It's a ceremonial plant for them. So they just didn't understand, you know, what is the purpose? Why are we growing this so much of this? How are people actually using it? In other words, and so they just didn't they did not feel that there was a meaningful reason why to stay there, and they refused to work. They left, they ran away, they escaped, and they went into the forest, the woods, and so on, and refused to work. So the planters, of course, many of whom were actually members of the British nobility, had to adopt a different strategy, an alternative source of labor, you know, and because they were noblemen, many of them again from England, they had servants, of course, back in England. They had their own servitude, that is. So they said, well, there are servants, you know, back in England, and why not bring our servants to grow the tobacco? So that's exactly what they're going to do, is that they're going to actually implement a new labor system. It was not just a matter of, well, let's bring our servants so they can work here, but rather let's craft a labor system that we're going to implement for the colony, for the company, that will be attractive, that will attract a lot of people from England. Anybody that wants to come here and work for a number of years and growing tobacco for the company will be compensated in a very, very significant way. So let's create a labor system to bring not only servants but also farmers. There's just a number of, you know, farmers in England that would like to come here. Their main problem is, the servants and the farmers, is that they don't have the money to pay for their transportation to come to the New World. Europeans understand that there's plenty of land here in America, but the vast majority of Europeans, they just don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the money to actually cross to the Americas again, to board a ship, pay for transportation costs, and it's so costly. So they had to stay in Europe, even though the opportunities are here. So what the British planters are going to say is, well, let us just then craft a system, a labor system, that will be very attractive to the British servants, the servitude, and the farmers, in which, in this labor system that became known as indenture servitude. This is a different labor system, of course, very different from slavery, by the way. Indenture servitude, and they're servants, but they're servants that are trying to pay back a debt. That's what it is, an indenture servitude, an indenture servant. They're indebted, okay, indebted servants, in other words, indebted servitude, in debt. So this is the system that dominated Virginia colony from 1619 to 1670, thereabouts. In the 1670s, again, indenture servitude, it was already been replaced, as we'll see, with slavery, with African slavery. But again, it pretty much dominated for many decades the Virginian economy. This is how, Virginia Company is operating, is by bringing servants from England under contracts, labor contracts, that is to say. So in this system of labor, what happens is that anybody that wants to come to the New World, what the company back in London, what they're doing, the London merchants that own the company, what they're saying is, look, the company needs labor, okay, and the company will be willing to pay for your labor. I'm sorry, for your transportation. If you don't have money to pay for your transportation to come to the New World, well, the company, because we need you, we're willing to pay for your transportation cost. We're actually going to assign you a master that you're going to be working for, a planter. Again, you're going to be growing tobacco. You learn everything about this trade. You learn everything about how to grow tobacco, etc. And at the end of 7 years, that's what the contract is for. It's a labor contract for 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, the company will release you. You will be a free person, and the company is going to actually give you land so you can actually grow tobacco for the company. Okay, so you'll know by that time, after 7 years of labor, you'll know everything about this trade. You'll know how to grow tobacco. You'll be a master. Okay, a master planter. Very attractive. Once again, very, very attractive proposal. So, again, they're going to actually bring hundreds, eventually, of course, thousands over the years of indentured servants that had to abide by certain, of course, regulations, norms. The contract is we're going to work for 7 years. We're going to work for a master. The master is going to take care of us, provide a cabin, provide clothing, food, etc. But we have to work, of course. So because we have to work for 7 years, we cannot marry during those 7 years. Why? Well, because you're here to work, not to, socialize or build a family and take care of other business, but rather this is a labor obligation. Okay, it's an obligation again to pay back your debt. The debt is, well, the company paid for transportation. Okay, there's a debt. You contracted a debt because the company is transferring you to the new world, and you're being presented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity just to work for 7 years, and then you become a landowner. Okay, you'll own land at the end. So again, it's a good trade. Yeah, you're going to have a debt for 7 years, but you're paying back the debt with your labor. Okay, that's what indentured servant is. They're going to be paying back that debt. But you cannot marry. There's no mingling, for example, that people can just have, kind of loose romantic relationships, because that will then, of course, lead to pregnancy, and then, and then of course you have to take care of your child when they're born. You're not going to be attending the fields, etc. So all of those type of activities, relationships were prohibited. They couldn't leave the plantations either, because if you leave the plantation, the likelihood that indentured servants are going to come back, they're already here in America. The company brought them. So you're in this plantation, and it will be very, very tempting to say, I'll be back. I'm going to step out just for a while and come back. You'll probably leave. You can go to Maryland, again to the north, or New England. There's, of course, still settlements, of course, to the north of Virginia. That you're going to be free there, by the way. So it's tempting, of course. They couldn't leave, and they were also subject to punishment as well. So what is very interesting to know is that in 1619, 1620, we also saw the introductions of also African servants, okay, in Virginia. There were some ships that arrived carrying, cargoes that included, among other things, of course, African slaves. And there also were introduced in Virginia colony, but they were not necessarily treated as slaves per se. They were treated as indentured servants as well. So the very first African slaves that arrived in 1620 in Virginia were also working side by side with English indentured servants. The labor was mixed. You got, of course, white and black servants, both working together, they had the same status, the same rights, the same obligations, and both could earn their freedom after 7 years. Okay, both. Okay, this was, again, the system of slavery doesn't exist at this point. African slavery as such is not present during this period of time that we're talking about, from the 1619, 1620 to the 1670s, not yet. So what we see is a labor force that is diverse in terms of, again, is mixed, and they're working side by side, by the way, both white and black, of course, servants. So this particular labor system is going to come to an end, as we'll see, particularly in the latter part of the 1600s. Listen, let's say from 1675 to 1700, we're going to see a shift, again, from indentured servitude to African slavery. Okay, there's going to be a replacement. That is to say, the planters are going to decide that indentured servitude was not working for the company. They're going to gradually end it, import less and less indentured servants in the last 25 years of the 1600s, so much so that by 1705, the main labor force of the colony is made up of African slaves. Okay, and there's almost no indentured servants being imported anymore into the colony. So what were the reasons why this occurred? What were the reasons? I'm going to list a couple of reasons. There were two factors that convinced Virginia planters that indentured servitude was not working. It was not an efficient labor system, and furthermore, that the system was creating instability, right, in the colony. The first factor that convinced them of that were natural factors, nature, okay, something that was natural. It was out of the control of humans, human decisions, etc. And that is that when indentured servants were brought to Virginia from England, they were brought into an area, initially, the very first settlements, where we would talk about Jamestown, for example, that area, the capital of Virginia, Jamestown, and the first plantations that were built around that area is called the Chesapeake Bay. It's a bay area in Virginia called the Chesapeake Bay. Very swampy, very hot, very humid, and it's ridden with mosquitoes. So when the indentured servants arrived to the Chesapeake Bay, they were confronted with the virus that those mosquitoes carry back in this time, as in the ancient world. The virus that was very lethal, again, that mosquitoes carried, was malaria. Okay, malaria. It will give people high fevers, chills, and they will die within days. So Europeans are now exposed to a virus that they have never been exposed, because Europe is so above the tropical region of the globe, is in a very cool climate. Geographically, again, the climate of Europe, particularly England, is just so cold that you're not going to see this kind of insect being so abundant, being so threatening, carrying malaria, for example. Once you get to the tropics, of course, when it's so hot and humid, you're going to see, of course, the mosquitoes being so much, abundant, and they're the ones that actually infect people with this virus called malaria. So we see a situation in which once Europeans leave their habitat, once they leave the continent of Europe and they go elsewhere, they're going to be confronted also with the germs, with the viruses, again, of other regions of the world that are carried in many cases by animals, again, like mosquitoes, for example. So again, the situation is that a great many of those indentured servants arriving to Virginia are dying in the first 2 or 3 years of work. There were high mortality rates from 1620 to 1650 in the Chesapeake Bay of indentured servants, to the point that 6 or 7 out of 10 indentured servants arriving didn't make it. Okay, didn't fulfill their contract obligations of working for 7 years. By the 3rd year, they will die because of malaria. Okay, so this presented a natural cause that rendered the institution of indentured servitude ineffective. Okay, ineffective. It's not working because the company still, again, investing in bringing in a lot of people from England, but the workers, the indentured servants, are not really making it because, again, they're dying. So during this time, of course, they understood that the alternative solution will be to replace the institution with African slaves, because it was understood that the peoples from Africa had a greater resistance to tropical diseases. Not that they will be totally 100% immune, but they had a greater resistance to it because they have been exposed for longer, for thousands of years. The peoples of Africa have been exposed to malaria. But during this period of time, the British had not yet entered full scale into the slave trade. Okay, from 1620 to 1650, the British are not yet in Africa and investing heavily in trading operations to trade slaves, etc. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, for example, the Dutch are in that trade, and if they're going to have to buy slaves, they'll have to buy them from those sources at very high prices. So it's going to be very costly, again, to simply just replace it. Let's say in 1630, 1640, immediately discarding indentured servitude for African slaves. It's not going to be very, wise financially to do so, because they're still very expensive at this point. So they're not going to make that change immediately. Not until, of course, indentured servitude presented problems inside of Virginia colony and created the conditions for a revolt, social unrest, and widespread rebellion. The system of indentured servitude kind of created social unrest and rebellion, to the point that when the rebellion erupted, at the end of the rebellion, the planters, the Virginia planters, decided to simply discard indentured servitude and replace it because it was creating instability, in other words, in the colony. So it needed to be done away. It needs to be replaced. So why is it that indentured servitude created instability? Okay, in what particular way? Well, what is going to happen is that Virginia colony is going to grow territorially as more planters arrive with land grants to develop plantations into Virginia. They're going to be moving farther and farther away from the Bay Area. So as more planters arrive, they're going to simply move to the frontier, to the western lands, and try to clear the land and develop lands away from the swamps, from the swampy region, from the hot and humid environment where the mosquito abounds. So as people are getting away from that habitat where there's the mosquito and the malaria, of course, infecting people, the people that live in the interior of the colony, they're moving into the interior of the colony, uh, had a greater chance of actually living up to their 7-year contract and fulfilling their obligations and be released. So the life expectancy is increasing as a result of people moving again away from the swamps again. More people move into the interior of the colony, they grow tobacco, they work for 7 years, and then they're released. They become what is called, back in this time, they're called the free men. Okay, so there's a new social group on the rise. The free men, they're called. And they're free because they're no longer indebted. They're not bound. They're not servants anymore. They're not in that status. They were released from the plantation. Now, this group is beginning to grow and grow. After 1650, we're going to see this gradual growth of a new social group that is very different from the traditional two groups that existed in Virginia. In Virginia, up to 1650, there were only two groups. Either you were a planter or you were an indentured servant. There was not an in-between. It was either or. But now there's a third group that they're the freemen, in other words. And what the freemen want is land, and they want to grow tobacco. Okay? So now they say, well, we've worked for those 7 years. We're free of debt, free of obligations. Now we want to own land, and we want to grow tobacco. We know everything about tobacco, and it's profitable. This is a cash crop that has a great demand, great market in Europe. So we want to go into business, okay, grow tobacco. The problem is that those lands that they seek are in the west of Virginia colony, and those lands are occupied, of course, by indigenous groups, of course, the Indian lands. So they go to Jamestown, the free man, and actually petition the governor of the colony, Governor Berkeley, to issue land grants. Okay, open the doors for Western settlement. But the governor, after a series of talks and deliberations, again, he's meeting with a council of planters in Jamestown, and they discuss the situation. They reach the decision to not open up the Western lands for settlement. Okay, they're not going to issue land grants to the freemen because that will upset, of course, the Indian alliance that the colony has with, of course, the Native American groups. The Indian alliances that were created for the purpose of the fur trade. So the colony is exporting tobacco back to England, but on the side, the colony is also trading with the Native Americans products that they like, they need, they want in exchange for furs. And this is another product that the colony is also exporting, furs. And so if they just move into their lands, the fur trade will be upset. Okay, and so this is a commercial activity that sustained the economy, the colonial, economy of Virginia. So this is one of the reasons again, but the other reason is that they're not willing to issue more land grants for them, the indentured servants, to move into those lands and occupy, is because eventually what they're going to do is grow tobacco. And the company right now is facing a crisis in the tobacco market, that there's an overproduction of tobacco. So much tobacco. The colony is producing so much tobacco that is flooding the market in Europe. And not only Virginia is producing tobacco, at this time there's also the colony of Maryland to the north of Virginia that is also producing tobacco, unrestricted. There's also the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean islands producing tobacco as well. And there's also the colony of Brazil, even the Brazilians, again, the Portuguese in Brazil, the planters, besides sugar, they're also producing tobacco. So it's just so much tobacco, in other words, that the prices are falling down in Europe. And so, since this is a tobacco company, if you just simply allow people to grow tobacco unrestricted, without any quotas, any limitations, again, this is going to flood the market. It will render the entire tobacco economy totally useless, in other words. It will be worthless. So this is another reason why Governor Berkeley will say no to occupying lands, because you're going to be growing tobacco. And as a matter of fact, in 1673, back in London, even London took action to kind of regulate the production of tobacco by issuing a new law back in London called the Tobacco Inspection Act of 1673. Okay, so the Tobacco Inspection Act of 1673 that came from London, by the way, was a law that established a system of permits and licenses and quotas for tobacco planters in Virginia. What that meant is, well, in order to grow tobacco, you need to have a permit to do so. Okay, you need to be licensed, and that license is issued in London. Okay, to be a legit plantation, in other words. And if you do have a permit and a license, you need to abide by a quota of production. You cannot just produce whatever quantity of tobacco you want, because we need to bring down production to make tobacco more pricey. We need to elevate the prices to make it, tobacco, if we make it scarce, if we limit the production of tobacco, the price of tobacco can go up. Right now it's coming down because there's so much of it. We need to bring it down. And to enforce the quotas, we're going to send inspectors, okay, to the plantations, so they can verify that you're a licensed planter and that you're abiding by the quota, in other words. So what that means is that even if the free man want to just grow tobacco, they can't, because they don't have the license. And if they don't have the license, if they're growing tobacco, they can lose their property, that is to say. So, of course, this exacerbated the tensions in Virginia, because what are the freemen going to do? They don't have land. They don't have an enterprise, that they can actually, use to sustain themselves. They don't fit in the colony because they're traveling from place to place. They don't have a residence. This is a kind of a floating population that is there, but it's not really settled. It's not, again, productive. It's not finding any type of economic security, any future for themselves. So, of course, this is going to lead to, to a revolt eventually. Those were previously indentured servants that are now free, and this population continues to grow because now the life expectancy of the indentured servants is increasing. So, at this point, they don't have, of course, somebody to lead them, because they're just simply floating around. They're very angry. They're anxious. Of course, they're frustrated. But the leader that will eventually mobilize them into a revolt is not going to come from one of them. This is going to come from one of the planter class, a Virginia planter by the name of Nathaniel Bacon, who was short-tempered, very young. He was in his late 20s during this time. Had just recently arrived to Virginia. He was part of the English nobility. He was sent by his family back in England to become a planter, to make it again in Virginia Company as a wealthy planter. It was it's kind of an enterprise. So he was assigned, he was given a land grant on the very outskirts of the colony, in the very western fringes of Virginia colony, and he was really neighbors with the Native Americans. But because he was short-tempered, he had a lot of clashes with Native American groups who were coming into his property, unwelcome, unrestricted. The Native Americans will simply come into the property, etc. And so he had a lot of clashes with them, and eventually he is going to become so infuriated that he wanted action. He wanted to take action against what we call them, the Indians. They were Native Americans, indigenous groups. So he goes to Jamestown, and during one of the meetings with the other planters in Jamestown, the capital, and with meetings with the governor, he's going to be petitioning, of course, the governor action against the Indians. He wants retaliation. He wants the governor to initiate a campaign against the Native American groups for his own personal reasons, but again, he's been denied, of course, that type of action. For reasons that you just explained, there's an alliance, there's a commercial alliance with the Indians, and so on and so forth. So again, he's so furious, and at some point he insults the governor. They had a moment, a friction, a fight, an argument, and Nathaniel Bacon insults the governor. Again, it turns very, very dramatic. The situation. Of course, he's thrown into prison for a few days. Nathaniel Bacon is just in prison for a few days, not a long time. But after he comes out of prison, he's now trying to take revenge against the governor. Okay, he's so furious against the governor that he's trying to build an alliance with other planters so they can actually remove the governor, from his post. But all the other planters don't want any problems. They abandon Nathaniel Bacon. They leave him alone. And so Nathaniel Bacon then turns around and says, well, there's a group of people here that are quite angry against the governor and against the colony because they don't have any land, and they also would like to take the land from the Native Americans, from the Indians, as he called them, the freemen. So, of course, he has found a group that will be willing to follow him and take revenge against the governor. That is to say, and he rallies, the free man. He says, yes, I understand you. You want land, and let's take it. So he takes the free man to the frontier and begins raiding some Native American settlements. He attacks some Native American settlements and kind of initiate an Indian war, so to speak, because eventually the Indians are going to retaliate against Virginia. So he kind of upsets this Indian alliance that Berkeley had built, that the Virginia Company was actually profiting from in the fur trade. He upsets that. And then he turns the freeman against Berkeley by taking all the freemen to Jamestown. He walks with all of those people. They're very angry, by the way, very frustrated, and they pretty much destroy Jamestown to the ground. Berkeley is able to flee just in time, and he's going to come back with reinforcements with 1,000 British troops to regain the colony. Of course, he provides a report that he has lost the colony. We don't have a colony anymore because Nathaniel Bacon is now leading a rebellion. It's called Bacon's Rebellion. In 1675, he attacked the Indian groups, and now he occupied Jamestown, but he's totally destroyed. Jamestown was totally destroyed. Now, before Berkeley returns, he finds that Bacon had actually died. Soon after having taken the capital, Jamestown, he died of gastrointestinal infection. It was so severe that he died within days. Okay, so because the leader is dead, the freemen were now scattered, and they went into different directions. They went into the woods, etc. And there was not a possibility to locate them per se because they were all scattered without the leader. So what happened then is that the colony was regained by Berkeley. He comes back with 1,000 British troops, after a few months, and they had to rebuild Jamestown, by the way, from scratch and kind of reorganize the colony. But as they're trying to reorganize the colony after Bacon's Rebellion, the Virginia planters and the company decided that indentured servitude was not really working, because it had created problems in that since the company couldn't really award any lands or issue tobacco licenses to the people that were freed, the freedmen as they were called, that if they continued to bring indentured servants into the colony, this situation was going to arise in the future. Another rebellion. There will be more indentured servants working for 7 years, earning their freedom, and then pressuring the colony for land, unable to get the land. There will be massive unrest and revolts, of course, eventually. So they decided we need to replace the system of labor. Stop importing indentured servants, okay? And instead, let's replace indentured servitude with a labor system that will be permanent, more stable, but most importantly, permanent. That the people that are serving in the plantations, they're working, they're laboring, that this is a permanent status. It's not something that they're going to be released or freed after a number of years. We need a permanent, system of serf labor or servitude, if you will, that is as a permanent status, that is to say. So they shifted then to, of course, African slavery. Of course, by 1680, what we're going to see is that there will be a great reduction on the number of indentured servants that are coming now to Virginia colony, and instead we're going to see now the import of African slaves. Of course, by 1680, we're going to see the introduction of the so-called black codes, which were actually slave laws. That's what a black code is. It's a slave law. That is to say, like, look, we're going to have a different system of labor. We're going to introduce now African slaves, and they're going to be the labor force, the workforce of the colony. That is to say, and this is going to be a permanent, again, status. The reason why this is also happening is because by 1680, the British are now participating in this slave trade. Again, they're now forming their own trading companies. They're now going into Africa, bringing slaves, so they can supply the slaves to their own colonies. So the Virginians don't have to now buy very expensive, in other words, slaves from the Portuguese and the other Europeans. Now they have their own companies. That is to say, they're more accessible, more affordable. So, again, the so-called slave codes in Virginia that were written between 1680 and 1705, of course, determined that in this new system of labor, the ones that will be the servants or the slaves, so to speak, will be the people coming from Africa. In other words, that this is a permanent status. In other words, the status is that you're going to be in the colony, but those that are coming into Virginia are going to be the servants, of course, and working in the plantations, growing the tobacco and doing all the other work. And even those that had come earlier to Virginia, the peoples from Africa that came in and that were introduced as servants, as indentured servants, that their status is going to change into the status of slaves. Again, in other words, that there will be no more African indentured servants. That is to say, there's just, again, slaves, in other words. Those slave codes also prohibited the marriage. Again, it's called interracial marriage between the Virginians, the English settlers, and the Africans. And of course, the status of slaves implied that slaves couldn't really participate in the political or economic life of the colony. For example, they couldn't testify in court or engage in commercial activities. Like, for example, if you're an artisan, you can craft an artwork and sell it on the market, for example, during the weekend. You couldn't hold property or participate in politics, for example. Couldn't travel without permission or assemble in great numbers in public spaces, and couldn't legally marry as well. Even though there were, of course, slaves that got married inside the plantations, they were not considered to be, of course, legal as well. So this became part of what was known as a kind of a slave constitution, so to speak, in which, again, we have a series of laws or slave codes or slave laws, again, that indicated, for example, the nature of the institution. For example, who were going to be the slaves and what kind of duties, responsibilities, etc. What they could do, couldn't do, etc. All of that. Something that is going to be mimicked once again, is going to be imitated in other colonies like the Carolinas and Georgia again. So again, Virginia was like the forerunner that kind of started providing some form of structure as to how the institution could exist, could function, could operate, in other words. So what it did, this transformation, this transition from indentured servitude to African slavery in Virginia, what it did, it was not just that it replaced one labor system for another. It did not just replace a labor system of indentured servitude that was created by a labor contract, 7 years, for a labor system in which people were now in permanent bondage, so to speak, providing labor. But it also transformed the society of Virginia and really made Virginia, a type of society that was very similar to the societies back in Europe, what called, again, let me just write it here. So you have what you call aristocracy or an aristocratic, society. Okay, so when you have an aristocracy, for example, or an aristocratic society, very similar to what, again, Europeans have during this time, is a society in which there's a series, societies, again, are divided into a different groups or groupings, each actually divided in Europe. The idea was, as it was in the rest of the world, when you have aristocratic societies, is that people were divided in different groups based on occupation, or trade. We started out this topic by understanding that this is in the ancient world. There's the existence of many different groupings. Okay, so we mentioned that, like the artisans, the peasants, the merchants, the warriors, the priests, etc. Again, in the ancient world, the different groupings divided based on trade and occupation. But what's going to happen here in Virginia, and is happening in many places of the American continent, is that it is true, people are going to be divided into different groups as well, based on occupation. But on top of that, besides being divided in terms of occupation, each group that perform a different duty, a different function, a different trade, are going to belong to a specific racial category. This is the division of society into different races, and each race is being given a specific occupation or duty to perform. So this is the difference now, that by the 1600s, particularly in this century, what we're going to see in the Americas, not only in Virginia, but also in the Spanish colonies, for example, in Mexico, for example, it was very common, in Central America as well, is that society will be divided into different groupings, And each group is going to perform a different occupation or function, but at the same time, that group is going to be categorized or labeled as a race. Of course, different races, in other words, the creation of race. This is the beginning of race, for example, in human history. This is what we know as a caste system. A system of castes, again, is, again, when you have castes, or castes as they're called, is that you have different groups in society totally divided, performing different functions, and now they're going to be divided by race. It's a racial division of labor, that is to say. And at the very, of course, at the very top of the society, the first caste, the first grouping is going to be, of course, in Virginia, the noble Englishmen. Those were actually members of the nobility that were born in England, and they were given the occupation, the function to be the governors of the colony. So to be a governor, again, in the colony, you need to be born in England. And the reason for that is simple, is, well, you need to be as closely as possible to the mother country. You need to be very loyal. You need to be very close to the king, to the parliament. And so who else other than a British nobleman born in England? Their loyalty is totally with the mother country because they were born there. So they can be sent to the colony and govern the colony in a very loyal way. In other words, very loyal, in other words. So again, this is the first grouping. Again, you know, they're considered different from all the other groups. The second group, of course, the second caste, were actually noble Englishmen, but they were born in America. And if you're born in America, you cannot be a governor, okay? But you can be a planter. You're nobility, you know, you're a nobleman, but because you were born in America, the highest position, your function will be to own a plantation. And that's, you know, prestigious enough. You know, you're going to be a planter, of course. That is the dominant enterprise, again, of the colony, to own land, to run a tobacco plantation. You're exporting, you're wealthy. So again, but you have to be a nobleman, okay? An English nobleman to actually own a plantation, that is to say, the planter class, of course. Now, below, of course, the planter class, we're going to have, of course, the free men. Those were indentured servants that earned their freedom. They were not members of the nobility. They have no nobility connections back to English families of any kind. They were servants or farmers. You know, their ancestors were servants or farmers back in England. They were just commoners. So those commoner Englishmen, again, born in America, will be given land, but they will be given land so they can become independent farmers, not planters. So yeah, they're going to give them some land for them to actually grow their own food and subsist from the land. Again, so we're going to see, of course, the rise of small farmers, of course. This is a separate group. Of course, in Virginia, in the South, again, independent farmers. They're not really prominent, they're not prestigious, they're not wealthy, but they have land, of course. They have land, they're growing their own crops there. Now, below, of course, there will be two groups. The servants, again, are going to be also at the very bottom, of course, of society. At the very bottom, of course, we're going to see, of course, the Africans. Those were the slaves, of course. So who is going to be the laborers of the plantations, etc.? Okay, African slaves. In this case, this is a separate group. It's a racial group, if you will, that is going to perform this particular function, okay, in society. You know, who grows the tobacco, who's doing the construction work, clearing land, etc. Okay, labor. In other words, the labor force, you know, they're African slaves. And they have that status. This is the separate caste. You know, if you're born into that caste, more than likely you're going to be, of course, remaining there permanently. But on top of the slaves, there will be another caste, a separate caste known as the mulattoes. Okay, the mulattoes were the house slaves. And the mulattoes were individuals that had both African and European ancestry. Okay, so they were had ancestors, you know, from Africa and ancestors from England. They were born in America, and they live inside of the house of the planter, the house slaves or house servants. They were treated differently because a great many of the mulattoes, of course, were the offspring of the planters. Okay, they were connected to the planter. Many of them were the sons and daughters, again, of the planters themselves. So they were treated as kind of family because they were connected to them, blood ties, that is to say. So they were treated differently. They were invited to live inside of the house and provide some form of household duty, household activities inside of the house, like cleaning, whatever it is. Again, they were treated quite differently, and they'll be treated as a separate caste altogether. Okay, so so we see the transformation again, not just of a labor system, but an entire society is born, divided into different castes. Those are actually racial groups, if you will, each performing different obligation, carrying out different functions, different duties, and the like again. So in sum, in this transformation that we just looked at, what we see is that in the 1600s, particularly in the 1600s, what we're going to be looking at in Virginia as in the rest of the Americas is the beginning of what is called racial slavery. What that means is that prior to the 1600s, I talked about in session 1 that slavery existed virtually all over the world. Okay, there's no doubt about that. Every society, every group, every civilization practiced it, but it was never really practiced because the people that were enslaved belonged to a specific race. It was never really based on race. Europeans enslaved other Europeans. Africans enslaved other Africans. Asians enslaved other Asians. It was never really a racial, a racial purpose, a racial understanding of slavery. But now, by the 1600s, what we're going to see more and more, particularly in the Americas, is that race will be now associated with race. That specific groups of people, those that are coming from the continent of Africa, coming particularly to America, are going to be placed in this category. They're going to be, of course, categorized as slaves, in other words. That this is a racial association, that is to say. So it's something new arising in human history, that is to say. Okay, so second, Virginia becomes an aristocratic society, and most of the southern colonies will become aristocratic. And what is an aristocratic society is that your social position is determined by birth. In other words, that your birth, the family, the group that you were born into, is going to determine who you are and your position in the society. So if you're born out of, families of small farmers, then more than likely you're going to be there, for the rest of your life. You're going to become a farmer. You're going to be part of this group. If you're born from a family of planters, then more than likely this is your status. You're born into this caste, the planter caste, and you're going to remain there for the rest of your life. Okay. If you're born a slave, likewise, etc., etc. Again, so there's no social mobility. It's very rigid. The system in which it's very, very difficult to get out of your group, because this is the way aristocratic societies are structured. They're rigid. They're divided into different groupings, and once you're born into a group, you stay in that group for the rest of your life. Of course, in sharp contrast, when you look at the upper colonies, you look at New York, you look at Pennsylvania, you look at New England, for example, what you're going to find there is that, people born into any situation can actually get out of that situation and become something else. In the upper colonies, there's going to be social mobility. Again, you can move in society even though you were born from a family of farmers. You can, through hard work, through discipline, through diligence, you can actually become a merchant, for example. You can become an artisan. You can become a manufacturer. You can become anything you want. Well, of course, it will, involve so many different factors, of course, how hard you work, luck, etc., opportunities and the like. But it's not going to be as rigid as it is in the South. That in the South, it's just so rigid that once you're born into a specific group, it's going to be very difficult to get out. Okay, so again, this is really shaping, of course, the colonies in a very different forms. The upper colonies and the southern colonies are going to be moving in different directions. The social structures are being formed in a very different way with the introduction of African slavery, of course, in Virginia. Okay, so that's all we have. Of course, with that, we end our discussion on this topic. This is the end of the fourth topic on the slave trade and slavery in Virginia colony. This is the end of that. Then we begin, of course, the following topic, the first session, next. Thank you. Bye-bye.